things off to Greg.
Yes, thank you, Shoshana. I'm Greg Core, with a little bit of a frog in my throat, excuse me. Greg Core, the Director of the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division in the Office of Special Education Programs. And today's presentation will be on correctional education. But before I get into that, I have a couple announcements to make. You may have seen that yesterday we had an Assistant Secretary of Education confirmed by the Senate, Glenna Gallo. Those of you who are in the Part B IDEA community may know Glenna as the former State Special Education Director of first Utah, and then more recently of Washington State. And we in OSEP are all looking forward to Glenna moving into her new role and providing national level leadership on early intervention, special ed, and rehabilitative services. Second announcement is that you may be aware, if you're either in Part B or Part C communities, that our information collection for our state performance plan and annual performance report is expiring. So we have a new proposed information collection, and that did go up on the Federal Register yesterday. The proposed revisions to Part C and Part B, which would go in effect with the state's FFY 2023 SPPAPR, which is submitted in February 2025. Remember, there's always like a 2-year gap. That these information collections are focused on results for historically marginalized populations, examining inequities in the implementation of IDEA, and ensuring state agencies are responsible for the oversight of early intervention providers and programs and special education services. So these information collections, which are proposed at this point, are available for a 60-day comment period. I did send out a message earlier this week that provides the links, so I won't try to read those off to you now, but there's a 60-day comment period, after which we will review the comments here in OSEP and make any changes that we deem necessary, and then it will go out again for a final 30-day comment period before it becomes final. 60-day comment period that I just mentioned will close on July 10th of 2023. So those are my two announcements, and I wanted to introduce today's topic. As I said before, it's correctional education. We know that approximately 65 to 70% of justice-involved youth have a disability. And while data collected about incarcerated youth varies widely, it's estimated that 30 to 60% of those incarcerated youth have disabilities. These statistics are even more disproportionate for youth of color with disabilities. We all know that involvement with the juvenile justice system has a damaging, snowballing effect for youth with disabilities. Limited and poor quality education while incarcerated and violations of the IDEA put youth far behind and make re-entry to school even more of a challenge. I want to thank Heather Olson and Curtis Kennard of our office for coordinating today's presentation. Joining them will be colleagues from the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Assistance Center for the Education of Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth. So I will turn the presentation over to Curtis. Curtis, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. You can see our contact information here. Heather and I will briefly speak to you concerning the collaboration and equity. But before we cover those two areas, I'd like to go to the purpose, which is on slide 5. Okay, the purpose is to educate the public on critical special education and related services that many states have failed to directly provide to students with disability who are incarcerated in correctional facilities. Next slide, please. Okay, we have the agenda. We just talked about the introduction and the purpose. As you can see, is collaboration, equity. DOJ is going to speak on the trends, child find faith and behavior support, and we have ND Tech going to speak to technical assistance. And at the end of the presentation, we have the resources and questions and answers. Next slide, please. Okay. Collaboration. As you know, if you've been following correction here, we've been talking about collaboration, which is just critical. And I just want to briefly say, just reiterate, what are some of the strengths in collaboration? Well, one, organization, make an organization very successful, and also also the organization to have common goals that's in mind. Also, it enables the organization to communicate clearly, effective listening, and also help the organization to take responsibility for any mistakes. And one of the important pieces is also have respect, and also have respect for the diversity of the colleagues and what they bring to the table. Now, with that being said, one important thing area that I would like to speak on just briefly before we get to DOJ is the National Center for Learning Disability. As you well know, on Monday the 8th, the National Center had a presentation and also their recording. You have a link here on the slide 7. However, we have also included the link in the chat. In that link in the chat, you also have a recording. So when you go to that link and click on it, it's going to ask you to register and you can listen to the recording. It's a lot of information, in fact, a wealth of information. But let me cover a couple of key points here. As Greg was just alluded to a few minutes ago, in that particular article, one of the data points was that 65% of the youth involved in Youth and Justice Center have a disability, okay? Think about that. Youth engaged in juvenile justice are more likely to stay in the system, okay? Think about why. Okay, youth with disabilities 3 times more likely to be arrested than students of their non-disabled peers. Now, think about that and what can be done to address that. As Greg was just saying, the estimated 30 to 60% of the incarcerated youth are students with disability. And as we talk about disproportionality, as you can see, students of color in many areas in education is awfully involved in the facility and correction facility, and as a high rate whether they have a disability or not, and also have a high rate of dismissal. So that's these different things we have to address, as well as if you're familiar, for our coordinators from Title I Part D, OSEP also have a discipline colleague letter, and we'll talk about discipline. And so we also have that in the back end of the resource slide. But one thing I would like to ask, and I'll read this, be patient with me, I'll read this verbatim. One thing we like to think about, what have you done? And think about it. And what are you going to do to address the problem of equity among youth and young adults with and without disability? As you can see, I have the individual that can be me, can be any individual, organization, LEA, parents, administrative teachers. So those are the questions you have to ask. Now, when you look at the personnel that's there, it still goes back to collaboration. Are you collaborating? Now, one of the benefits of collaboration is encourage problem solving. So it would take the village to actually problem solve this. No one entity can do it. OSEP can't do it by itself, neither with SEA. It's going to take a collaborative effort with collaborative partners, and don't forget parent engagement. So with that being said, I would turn it over to Heather, which will talk more concerning equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kennard. When you hear the word equity, what comes to mind? Think for a moment about the true meaning of this word. On the slide, you see the definition brought forward from the White House: the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment. Now think about equity and correctional education. These two things, unfortunately, are not frequently connected. As we deepen our understanding of equity, it is critical we embed it into corrections education to ensure our marginalized students receive a truly free and appropriate public education while they are involved in the justice system. Today, our presenters will take us on a deeper dive into understanding the important roles of collaboration and equity in corrections education. Next slide, please. Emily Keller is a trial attorney in the Special Litigation section of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Emily's work at the Civil Rights Division includes protecting the rights of children confined in juvenile and adult detention and correctional facilities, including children's special education rights. Prior to joining the U.S. Department of Justice, Emily was a supervising attorney at the Juvenile Law Center, where she focused on protecting the rights of children involved in the justice system. Welcome, Emily. Next slide, please. Joining Emily is Dr. Daniel Frummel, who is the Senior Technical Assistance Advisor for Longevity on the NDTAC program. Prior to joining the NDTAC team, Daniel served as a Senior Director of Non-Traditional and Non-Public Programs with the Tennessee Department of Education. He has also worked at the local level, spending almost a decade as a principal and then executive director of a psychiatric residential treatment program for children and adolescents. Additionally, he has served in various administrative levels at the building and district level for special education in public school districts in Tennessee and South Carolina. We will now turn it over to our wonderful presenters. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm Emily Keller, and as Heather said, I work at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. I just wanted to provide a little bit of background about how the Department of Justice is involved in this work. The U.S. Department of Justice can investigate juvenile and adult correctional facilities where there's reason to believe that children's rights are being violated under the Constitution or under federal law, and this includes the IDEA. At the Justice Department, this work is done in the Special Litigation section of the Civil Rights Division, which is where I work. Our investigations include both juvenile and adult facilities, including both detention facilities and longer-term post-disposition or post-conviction facilities. As part of our work in our investigations, when the Civil Rights Division finds patterns or practices of violations, so we're looking for systemic violations of rights, not just individual violations of children's rights, we can seek remedies, often in the form of settlement agreements. And so in the course of the conversation today, what I'll be talking about are some common violations that we have encountered in the course of our investigations. I'll turn it over to Dan.
All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Dan Frummel. I'm just pleased to be here with you guys today. Appreciate the opportunity to present today. I want to talk a little bit. So I work for NDTAC and serve on the Technical Assistance Center there. We support Title I Part D. And for many of you, that might not be a program that you're intimately familiar with unless you are a coordinator or working in an LEA that receives funding through Title I Part D. But this is the section of Title I that provides additional funding to students that are in correctional facilities through Subpart 1 and Subpart 2. In short, through Subpart 1, we provide, or the U.S. Department of Education through Title I Part D provides funding to state agencies that have the responsibility of educating students that are in delinquent facilities. Oftentimes, this includes organizations like your child welfare agency in your state, Department of Corrections, or the Department of Health, Mental Health, if they're responsible for the education of students in their care. The other section of this funding is subpart 2. And subpart 2 is funding that goes to LEAs that have a delinquent facility within their boundaries that's locally operated. And so most often this looks like a juvenile detention center that's within the jurisdiction of the school district there. A lot of times it might be run by the sheriff's office or the police department, but it could also be run by a private, for-profit, or non-profit organization that's in the care of students. So the funding goes to the LEAs, and then they are charged with providing those services to students within the program. And again, much like Title I, these are supplemental types of services that are aimed at improving the educational outcomes for students in correctional programs. Turn it back over to Emily.
Thanks. So we're going to start going through some of the common concerns that we've encountered in our investigations. And so one issue that we frequently encounter is our child find concerns, and that facilities lack policies and practices to identify students who are in need of special education services. We tend to see this in two areas that I want to talk a little bit about today. First is at intake, when a child first arrives at a facility, and then second, the ongoing assessment of students once they're in the classroom. So starting with intake, we find that facilities often lack policies and practices to review the information of incoming students, including school records, results of assessment testing, information from intake interviews, to identify students who may be in need of special education services. We see particular problems when facilities don't properly obtain records from the students' home school districts. Those records include important educational information. It includes students' IEPs, referrals for special education evaluations, potentially lapsed evaluations that never were completed. But even for students who haven't previously touched the special education system, the school records contain important information about the student's educational history, behavioral history, information about school disruptions, school exclusions, which is all information that may help inform the school in deciding whether a child may be in need of special education services. So as a result of that, getting information promptly from the home school districts is really essential to the child find process. And I do want to acknowledge that this is an area that can take a lot of work and require a lot of follow-up. For example, even in facilities that have good protocols when a student arrives, of immediately contacting the prior school to get school districts, we've seen sometimes facilities still don't have policies and protocols to track when records come in, or to follow up if records don't come in. And this can be a challenge. Some of the children who are in the facility schools may have been in multiple placements. So even figuring out who's holding the most recent school records can take time, and without quick and consistent follow-up, there can be long delays between when a child arrives at the facility and when the facility actually gets the student's records. So that's kind of what we see at intake. I do want to talk a little bit about child find post-intake. So when a child has been in the classroom, and teachers and staff can assess the student performance. And we find that when students are struggling academically or behaviorally, many facilities, schools, again, lack protocols to assess whether the child may be in need of additional interventions or should be referred for an evaluation. And I just want to flag that it's so important, because the correctional facilities often serve students who, as I mentioned before, have been disconnected from school or have been in multiple placements in multiple school districts or multiple schools. And facility schools really have an important role in identifying students with disabilities who may have fallen through the cracks, in part because of all of that transition in some of these young people's lives. The next slide.
And so thinking about kind of some strategies to implement resources through Title I Part D, like Emily said, I think it really starts with collecting those records in a timely manner. And I'll be honest with you guys, in my bio, it talked about, I started my career as a principal in a residential program, and I was pretty naive to the fact of how hard it can be to collect accurate records. I remember in my first couple weeks as a principal there, we had like an admissions coordinator for education, and she came into my office and she said, we've been trying to get the students' records for about 2 weeks now, and I'm not sure what classes to put them in. And I said, how can this be? How do we not know what classes the student should be in? And she went through the steps that she had gone through. She had talked obviously with the parent, with the child. They weren't totally clear on which school we should be contacting. So after some research, we figured out what school he was supposed to be enrolled in, called that school. Student had never enrolled there. So there was just already off the bat a gap in the education there. Did some more detective work, went back, found the previous school. Student had only been there for 6 months. So we were able to get a piece of the record and had to go back to 3 or 4 different schools and then try to piece these academic records together to see, what credits the student has, what courses they should be in, and, were they identified as having a disability? Do they have an IEP? And so we really needed somebody that was just dedicated, had that background knowledge, had a strong system in place to really be able to track down these records and try to get them in a timely manner. So some things that we can do to support with this, I think at the SEA level, at the state level, we can look and see, do we have written expectations and guidance on the need for timely records transfer for students that are in correctional programs? I think this is so important because it sets that expectation across the board, whether it's the facility that is delaying sending records back to the LEA or the LEA that has, for whatever reason, delayed records in getting to the facility. I know as a facility administrator, as a principal, it was nice when I had a policy from the state that I could kind of point back to and say, hey, we really need these records. Here's the expectation from the State Department. Things like that always help to move things along a little bit faster. Supporting facilities and adopting child find procedures. Again, like Emily talked about, not all of our programs have strong procedures in this way. Oftentimes at the LEA and at the state level, we have very strong procedures though. And so how are we working with our facilities to ensure that they are adopting these child find procedures and using them within their programs? Any of these programs that receive Title I Part D funding, which the majority of them should or do, they have to fill out an application each year to receive this funding. As part of that application, a lot of times there are questions that are embedded in there that talk specifically about special education. So if you wanted to do a little bit of an audit and kind of look through those applications to see which facilities, which programs have stronger special education programs, that's going to give you a little bit of a flavor of how well those programs are understanding the law, how well they're meeting the needs of the students. Might give you an idea of which programs need more intensive technical assistance and which ones seem to have a more comprehensive understanding of the law of IDA. Next area there is having your Title I Part D administrators and your IDA administrators working together to provide leverage and support for facilities and LEAs who may encounter barriers in securing records. So if I'm a facility trying to get records from an LEA and I'm having difficulty, what's my next step? Who can I reach out to at the State Department to assist me in collecting these records? I know when I was a Title I Part D administrator in Tennessee, I would have LEAs call me from time to time and say, hey, we had this student transfer in from such and such facility and we can't get a hold of anybody. Can you help us out? And a lot of times as that Title I Part D administrator, I had those connections because we were working with these folks on a fairly regular basis, and we were able to kind of break the logjam, help to get some things moving in the students' records where they needed to be. And then thinking about developing some standard educational intake procedures or checklists for facilities and staff to utilize, with that strong emphasis on what special education records should they be asking for from an LEA when a student is coming into a facility. I know that might sound pretty basic, but sometimes there might be that lack in expertise. in understanding exactly what they should be looking for and exactly what they should be asking for. And then from a state agency, so again, thinking about our child welfare agencies, Department of Corrections, and our LEA staff, they can, if they're receiving Title I Part D funding for the different correctional programs, they don't have to, but they can use some of that funding for hiring a transition coordinator, somebody that is solely dedicated to ensuring that we are getting accurate records and evaluating those records thoroughly to see if a student already has an IEP in place. Again, this might seem like a simple task. I know when I started in my job, I thought, why do we have somebody just for this? And we only have 50 kids in our program. Well, when I saw how complex it was and just how much work it took to get one complete academic record on a student, how many hours or days it took, it dawned on me that yes, this is one of the most valuable positions that I have. Additionally, it's just a highly mobile population. So even in your smaller programs, there's a highly likelihood that they have students coming in and leaving their program every single week. So even though they might only serve 50 students at a time, they might serve 150, 200, 300 students throughout the course of a year. Back over to Emily.
So the next category we want to talk about is pretty broad, and it's the provision of a free, appropriate public education. So I'm going to highlight again some of the most frequent concerns that we encounter. So the first bullet point looks familiar, but I do want to emphasize it in this context as well. So we talked about the importance in obtaining IEPs from homeschool districts for the child find purpose, but obviously it's really important for this purpose too. And Dan referenced that as well, that unless you have the student's IEP, you're not going to be able to implement the IEP. So the sooner that those records can come and the school can get the IEP, the sooner that it can be implemented in the facility school. So to the next point, reductions in special education and related services. We've seen concerns where when students enter a facility, their IEPs are revised, and they're kind of automatic reductions in the services that the child is being offered. So while I think it's really appropriate when students come to facilities for the education and special education staff to review the child's IEP and to consider whether revisions are necessary or appropriate, it's really important that any revisions are based on the individual needs of the students and that they're designed for the student to make appropriate progress in school, and not just kind of a policy of across the board cuts, maybe based on resources or perceived resources available at the facility school. I'm going to skip and talk about the failure to provide related services. So facility schools need to make sure that children with related services in their IEPs receive the services that they're entitled. And we've seen in some facilities where these services or certain related services aren't provided at all, or where they're not provided at the duration and frequency required by the child's IEP. And this is an area where I want to note that there may be some related services where the facility itself doesn't have a service provider in-house and may need to locate and identify an appropriate service provider, figure out, maybe even create a contract with that service provider. And even where they already have a service provider identified, it may take time to get on that provider's schedule. So making sure, especially for the most frequent related services that are coming up, that there's a plan in place, it's clear who should be contacted, and that there's a way to make sure that the kids who are in these facility schools quickly get into the rotation, and so that they're getting the services that are in their IEPs. And then I want to talk about other concerns about how IEPs are actually implemented within the facilities. and specifically about the failure to implement modifications and accommodations that are in the students' IEPs. And this can be a challenge in many facilities. As Dan mentioned, there are facilities that serve highly mobile and transient populations of students. So a teacher may not know today who's going to be in their classroom tomorrow, let alone whether or not that student has an IEP and what's in the IEP. So this is an area where no matter how frequently there's turnover within the population, it's really, really important to have protocols in place to make sure that the teachers in the classrooms know when student records come in from the homeschool, know if the child has an IEP, know what's in the IEP, and have the training and support necessary to implement what's in the IEP. And it's already been mentioned a couple of times, the high percentage of children in juvenile facilities that have disabilities, with the range is broad from 30 to 60%. And many of these students are entitled to receive special education services. So even in facilities with relatively small populations, the need for special education teachers and staff may be high, and the resources required to provide all of the services that are in the students' IEPs, because there may be such a high percentage of students with IEPs, may be quite high. I want to talk about the instructional model at facility schools. Facilities need to make sure that whatever their instructional model is, it accounts for students with IEPs and their individualized needs. Some schools rely on computer-based or packet-based instruction. So we've seen this a lot in COVID, and then also in other periods of lockdown. But sometimes this is also just the model for the school, even when it's not a special quarantine or lockdown. And sometimes these, as I said, sometimes these educational or instructional models aren't tailored to the individualized needs in the students' IEPs. And there are many students with disabilities who may have a difficult time understanding directions, processing instructions, completing assignments, maintaining attention to assignments without in-person teacher support. The last bullet point is somewhat related, but we've also seen facilities where there are no educational services, including special education services, provided at all when children are in isolation and lockdown. And obviously this is a major concern. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but children do retain their right to special education services when they're in isolation, lockdown, room confinement. I know there are lots of different terms for it. And so there needs to be mechanisms in place to make sure that students are receiving the education that's required by their IEPs, even if they're not in the classroom. And next slide.
So just kind of going back to a point that Curtis had made at the beginning of the presentation, that a lot of this really starts with that coordination and collaboration at all levels between our Title I Part D coordinators and staff and our IDA staff. And the reason for that is that our IDA staff, they've got the knowledge, they've got the expertise, they know the law, they know how the special education program should work. Our Title I Part D staff, they know their programs. They know the setups there, they have the connections there. And so we really got to start with that joint mindset in order to start to move things forward in this area. The second area that I want to talk about is around the area of professional development. And I have the saying there, you know, when we know better, we do better. I've been to a lot of different correctional programs throughout my career, and you know, every time I've sat down and I've met with an educator there, met with an administrator there, I find that they generally want to do the right thing, right? I've never met somebody that says, nah, we just don't want to provide services for that student, or don't want to fulfill their IEP. What I find where the breakdown usually occurs, in my opinion, with faith, is that sometimes they might not know what the law says, or what they should be implementing with IDA, or they know what the right thing is to do, but they're not sure how to do that given the context of their setting. Okay, and so I think that there are a couple things that we can do to help them out. First one is really around this area of professional development. Helping all folks in correctional programs, regardless if it's at a state agency or a local agency, big or small, to understand what their responsibilities are under IDA. We need to think about this from a local and a state level. If we're doing professional development at the local level, are we inviting the folks from the correctional facility to our professional development events? If we're doing it at a state level, do we have good connections? Again, this is where we can use our Title I Part D coordinators to really advertise those events and invite those staff that are working in the facilities to our state professional development events, so that they can be current on what's going on in the state and what the responsibilities are for them in serving students with disabilities. Additionally, if these programs receive Title I Part D funding, they can also use Title I Part D funding for professional development. So they could use that to travel to a state event. They could even use that to travel to a national conference or professional development event to better educate themselves on their requirements under IDA. And then the last thing that I have on there, and I know this one's a big ask, but yeah, at the LAA level and at the state level, I encourage you to conduct joint visits to the different programs, going on site, visiting each facility to better understand any potential barriers that they might have to implementing IDA in each program. Because one thing that I've learned going to all these different programs is that if you've seen one correctional program, you've seen one correctional program. They are all just so different across the board. There are some that it's a real kind of mom and pop shop with one teacher who's the general ed teacher, the special ed teacher, the principal, and everything wrapped up in one, to programs that are quite robust and resemble more of a traditional school setting. And the challenges and the barriers that those teachers and those programs face can be uniquely different. And so it's hard to say from a national perspective that we need to do this or we need to do this, because a lot of this problem solving does have to occur on a pretty individualized basis with the different programs, given the staff that are there, the context is there. It also allows you a chance to meet with some of the administration at the program that are not educationally based. Right, so it's a school within a detention facility or within a correctional facility, and sometimes the administrators of the correctional facility don't fully understand the obligations that they have for the students with disabilities within their program. And so some education on that level, some problem solving on that level can go a really long way in empowering the teachers in the programs to get the tools that they need in order to improve services for students with disabilities within the programs. And I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you. So the next topic we wanted to discuss were behavioral supports and concerns regarding behavioral supports and response. So a common concern that we see when we are investigating facilities is that disruptive behavior and acting out in classrooms is almost treated automatically as a discipline problem, a discipline concern, without consideration of whether it may be tied to a child's disability. So rather than considering whether the child may be in need of further interventions, of functional behavioral assessment, a behavioral intervention plan, the response is often just to discipline, including at times removing the child from the classroom altogether. And so I also did want to talk about classroom removal, because this is, I think, an area where we often see, get questions and see concerns and misunderstandings about what's required under the IDEA, and see a failure to conduct manifestation determinations within facility schools. So just when a child's removed from the classroom due to school-based conduct, whether it's the child sent into their cell or some common area in the facility, or they're sent to some form of disciplinary isolation or room confinement, and the removal meets the standards in the IDEA, so it constitutes 10 or more consecutive or cumulative days, the school has to conduct a manifestation determination. And I think where we often see confusion is kind of the distinct roles that are often played within the facility. So in lots of facilities, the teachers may be the ones that write up the incident report for school-based conduct, but the other staff, non-educational staff, facility staff, or correction staff are the ones that actually impose the discipline, including determining how long the child will be removed from a classroom or placed in some sort of isolation. And so even in those situations, even when it's the non-educational staff that it imposes the consequence for school-based conduct, schools need to conduct manifestation determinations when that period of time is met. And I'll pass it over to Dan.
Yeah, and I think for both of those things, again, just thinking of the slide that I talked about earlier, that professional development, ensuring that the staff that are working with the students know these things, and then also those joint visits can go a long way in helping to problem solve with the non-educational staff in the program to figure out, how do we do this in a safe manner? How do we problem solve through this? And a lot of that has to occur, I believe, in just those rich kind of conversations with the staff in the program there. Outside of that, Title I Part D funds, obviously we cannot use these funds to fulfill services in a student's IEP. But there are some things that the funds can be used for that will hopefully help a student out, maybe before the fact, before they go into a correctional program, or maybe before they get to a point where they need these services on their IEP. And so Title I Part D Subpart 2 funds, so the funds that are going to an LEA, can be used for at-risk programming as well. So if an LEA has a correctional, a delinquent facility correctional program within their boundaries, and they're receiving Title I Part D funds, Subpart 2, they, after they've met the needs of the students within the delinquent program, they can also reserve some of that funding to operate a program within the LEA for at-risk students. Students might be at risk of ending up in the system. And so that's one way that we can help to support students. We can use Title I Part D funds to support behavior through things like counseling, peer mediation, mentoring, coordination of health and social services, parent and family engagement, and also just generally connecting students and families to those wraparound services. I'll turn it back over to Emily.
So we next want to talk about transition services. And before I jump in, I just want to clarify that there are at least two different types of transition plans and transition services that are discussed in the context of kids in correctional facilities, and specifically kids with disabilities in correctional facilities. First is the transition plans for teenagers required under the IDEA. And then there also kind of is a separate category of transition plans focused on the child's transition from the facility school back into their home school or whatever their next school will be. So I'm just going to specifically be talking about transition plans that are required by the IDEA. So this is an area where we often see concerns related to the adequacy of the transition plans. We often see boilerplate goals that look similar, if not identical, from student to student and aren't really tailored to the child's individual needs. And thinking about what's required under the IDEA for these plans, it's really supposed to focus on the child's post-school goals. So thinking about their post-secondary education, vocational education, employment, independent living, community participation. So what that will look like may be very different from student to student. And so making sure that there's really consideration of what's coming next for the particular child and what services can be offered to support that transition is really important. This is also another area where even where there's an adequate written plan, there just may be a lack of services and supports available within the correctional facility. And when you think about this area compared to children who are in community schools and have kind of resources of community organizations available to them, just what can be offered, what's available within some of these facilities can look very different. So this is an area where I think facilities often need to be creative about what supports and services that they can offer, what may already be available within the facility to build some of the independent living skills or vocational skills or employment skills. Also considering if there are opportunities online to connect kids with opportunities. You know, the kids may not be able to participate in the community itself and leave the walls of the facility. So thinking about whether or not there are organizations or services that can come into the facility to help meet some of these goals. And I think transition planning is obviously important for all students with disabilities, but want to emphasize that children who have been in correctional facilities may face additional barriers to education, employment, and independence. And so really putting together a thoughtful, practical, individual transition plan can really help address some of those barriers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
And Title I Part D kind of talked about the other side of the transition, not the transition services on the IEP, but that physical transition for a student going from a facility into the LEA or the other way around. And this is covered under both Subpart 1 and Subpart 2. Subpart 1 does have a stronger emphasis on it. Again, this is the funding that's going to our state agencies. They have a requirement in there that they have to spend 15 to 30% of their funds towards transition services. So when the law was written, they really understood that transition is such a critical point for students that we want to make sure that some of that funding, a portion of that funding, is being directed in that way to support students as they're going from one program to another. Some of the ways that that can be supported, I talked about hiring transition coordinators, somebody that can really dive in and help out with that process. Transition packets, just kind of making sure that the student has everything that they need when they're leaving the program, going to their next placement or next school system. Counseling services, academic and job placement services. And again, that whole idea of connecting families to wraparound services as part of that transition process. The last thing I would say about this is that when possible, one of the most important things we can do when a student is transitioning from a facility back into an LEA is to hold a transition conference, to have a meeting with the program staff at the facility and the staff at the school or the LEA that the student is going back to, so that we can talk about how the student did in the program. What did we learn about the student that can help them to be successful in their next placement? Make sure that the next placement has everything that they need, so we can make sure that there's a smooth handoff. Because I know it's not a great experience for a principal when a student who's been in a detention center shows up unannounced enrolling in school. It can cause a lot of confusion, where we can avoid a lot of that if we have those meetings beforehand. And I know sometimes that's easier said than done. I know that sometimes students transition out of programs with very little notice for a variety of reasons, but don't let that be the reason why we don't try, right? A lot of our students, we do know when they're transitioning. They do have set transition dates. Really planning for that ahead of time can make a significant difference in the life of that student as they're transitioning from one educational setting to the next. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Heather and Curtis.
Hello, We have some technical assistance resources that we would like to share with you to provide more information on the presentation today. This slide you'll see provides further information regarding recent cases in correctional education, and it can be found by following the links on this slide. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll find resources related to neglected, delinquent, or at-risk Title I Part D programming. Next slide, please. Again, neglected, delinquent, Title I resources. Next slide. Using the resources and links on this slide and the next, you can dive deeper into the work of the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division at OSEP. Next slide, please. The resources on this slide include links to the Correctional Education Guidance Package and Dear Colleague letters, which provide further clarification on the requirements of IDEA for students who are incarcerated. Next slide, please. The Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, has developed a voluntary state correctional education self-assessment, SCES, to assist states in self-assessing their systems for providing special education and related services to students with disabilities in correctional facilities. This self-assessment addresses some, but not all of the requirements of Part B of the IDEA as they apply to states, state educational agencies, and public education agencies, including local education agencies, and responsible non-educational agencies in educating students. Details of the SCES are found on this slide, as well as model interagency agreements. We will now move on to questions and answers. Next slide, please. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Kennard.
Yes, are there any question? I think I see one question in from Deanna, I think intake. What are the requirements for providing 504 accommodation in juvenile and or adult correction facility? That is a great question. I know that if I remember correctly, we have an IDA in 504. What I can do is send you that information that we have listed, because the accommodations is that's really critical. And for those that have an IEP, it really drives that. And if they don't have an IEP, it's being closely connected with evaluating the student and making sure he or she has the appropriate accommodation based on the psychological evaluation. But that is a really loaded question. What we can do, we can send also that link to the department that actually give you more detail, because it goes into OCR requirements, IDA requirements, and general education requirement. And so we will send that out. We also can send it out to the participant that's on the call. So I really appreciate that question. Are there any other questions that someone want to ask live? I believe we have a few minutes, so if there are any questions that we can open up, Shoshana, if someone want to ask live, we'll try our best to answer. If we can't answer, what we'll do, we'll just make sure we'll get back to you. You can drop your name and email into the chat, and we will follow up. Okay, I see a question in from Ronnie in Pennsylvania. Do you find education entities are able to share records with probation officers that comply with FERPA? Oh, that's another good question. And Heather, please help me out. The one thing I would say from the probation officer side, going back what Daniel said, and also what Emily alluded to, one of the missing links is some type of interagency agreement. If you know in IDA, we have 300, 154, And under 30154, it talks about the bullet points in there about IDA and interagency agreement. And also, if you go back to the September presentation, we have links in there to what an interagency agreement would look like across different agencies. And when you come to the FERPA, as you know, when you're talking about records and moving records forward, a agency or a facility can have access to records if it used for educational purposes. And I think that's under 99, I think 334. We also have that, and we can also give you more information on that, but make it clear the breakdown there, Ronnie, is not having any connectivity or any type of procedures when the student transitioned from the school district through the court system to the facility. And that's the big breakdown, because as you know, the probation officer is the first person that will have connectivity with the student. And it's important that they are in the loop to inform the district of where the student is, if he or she is locked up in the facility or they're in the court system. So I'll try my best to answer in a short time, but we can follow up on that as well. I see here another, is the department consider updating DOJ OSEP Dear Colleague letter? That's a question from my director. We will come back to that. Also, I see another, based on the recommendations made in the NCLD, what I talked about, unlocking future report, I believe what we're trying to get to here, the question is, basically how we're going to follow up on the recommendations. But I would say we're getting short on time. I would say going back to the chat, and if you don't have it, we can follow up. We had on May 8th, there was a presentation and that recording there, and it provides a lot of good information. And I believe that our agency took that information to heart, and we will work collaboratively with any agency to try to build thereon. That's why it's important when it's going back to collaboration. I see we have probably about a minute. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Dr. Greg Core, to close out.
Okay, we really did fill up all that time today. Again, I want to thank Curtis and Heather for pulling this presentation together today, and a special thanks to our special guests from DOJ and from ND Tech today, Emily and Daniel, for sharing not only the issues that they've confronted in their positions, but also giving us some really good ideas for solutions so that we can kind of interrupt that downward trajectory that we see so much of these young people in, and provide them with the support they need, not only in educational facilities, correctional facilities, but also in the communities. So thank you again, and thanks for everybody for tuning in today, and have a great rest of the evening.